My fiancé told me. I'm tired of pretending your simplicity feels romantic instead of limiting. I calmly took off the ring, paid the restaurant check, and walked away without resistance. Months later, she broke down after seeing my face on a Billboard advertisement outside the same office building where she worked reception every morning. You know what? I'm tired of pretending your simplicity feels romantic instead of limiting. The words arrived between bites of bread and the soft ambient hum of a restaurant that had no idea it was witnessing the end of something. I remember the specific detail of a candle flickering between us. I remember the way Hannah's fingers rested loosely around her wine glass, like she was holding something she'd already decided to put down. I didn't react immediately, not because I was processing shock, not because the words had knocked the air from my lungs. I didn't react because something in her voice was so casual, so unbothered, that it felt less like a wound and more like a weather report. Cold front coming in. Dress accordingly. She continued. You've always been comfortable being average, Connor. And I've spent 5 years trying to make peace with that. I can't anymore. Average. The word floated across the candlelight and hung there. I looked at her. Then I looked down at my hand, at the ring on my finger, the matching set we'd picked out together on a Saturday in March, laughing at the absurdity of how nervous we both were, how the jeweler kept offering us coffee like that would help. I looked at the ring for a long moment. Then I took it off. I set it quietly beside her drink. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical weight. Just placed it there, the way you'd set down a pen after finishing a letter. Clean. Final. Done. She blinked. I raised my hand for the waiter. Check, please. Hannah opened her mouth. Closed it. I didn't look at her again while I waited. When the bill arrived, I paid it without glancing at the total, tucked my card back into my wallet, and stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up nothing from the table. There was nothing left there that belonged to me. I walked out. No argument. No raised voice. No speech about everything I'd given her or everything she was throwing away. No moment where I gripped the back of the chair and leaned in and said all the things I could have said. Just the sound of my shoes on the restaurant floor, and then the night air, and then silence. That was the last time Hannah and I were in the same room for a long time. She thought, in that moment, that she had won. I know this because Qley told me later, without intending to tell me anything useful, that Hannah had gone home that night feeling relieved. That she described the evening as overdue. That she'd said I took it better than expected, almost disappointingly so, like I hadn't even cared enough to fight for her. She had no idea. She couldn't have known what had already been set in motion. She couldn't have known that the life she was walking away from was not the life she thought she understood. She had looked at me and seen a ceiling. She hadn't thought to look for the door I'd already opened behind her. The next time she saw my face, she couldn't stop crying. Here is what I lost in the weeks that followed, on paper. I lost Hannah. Obviously. 5 years. 11 months of an engagement. The particular intimacy of someone who knows how you take your coffee and which side of the bed you prefer and what your voice sounds like at 2 in the morning when you're half asleep and still answering a question. That kind of familiarity doesn't evaporate cleanly. It lingers in muscle memory and in the wrong moment when you reach for your phone to tell someone something and then remember there's no one waiting for the message. I lost the apartment. It was technically hers, her name on the lease, her decision to move there first, her aesthetic in every corner of it. I had never fully arrived in that space the way she had. Still, I had lived there for 2 years, and leaving meant carrying boxes into Ethan's spare room like I was 22 again, which is a specific kind of humbling that nobody prepares you for at 31. I lost the wedding that existed only in planning documents and a Pinterest board Hannah had built obsessively over 10 months. The venue deposit. The photographer she negotiated with for weeks. The dates circled on a calendar I no longer owned. I lost the version of the future I had practiced. The one where I knew what the next 5 years looked like, what the apartment would look like in 2 years, what we'd argue about comfortably, what routines we'd settle into. Losing a future is a strange kind of grief because there is no object to mourn. There's only the sudden absence of a certainty you hadn't even noticed you were leaning on. And then I lost something smaller but somehow sharper, the social story. Because nobody knew my side of it. What they knew was that Connor got dumped at a restaurant. What they knew was that he walked out quietly, which everyone interpreted as defeat rather than decision. Within a week, mutual friends had assembled a sympathetic narrative in which Hannah had finally done what everyone assumed was coming, and I was the one left standing in the rubble. What nobody knew, not Qley, not our mutual friends, not Hannah herself, was that something had already happened before that dinner. Something that had changed the entire geometry of what I was walking away from and what I was walking into. I didn't realize it at the time, not fully. But that night, leaving that restaurant, I wasn't as lost as I looked. That moment changed everything. I just hadn't seen the shape of it yet. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I turned 31 in October. Hannah was 29. We had been together since I was 26 and she was 24, long enough that our relationship had outlasted 2 of her friend groups, 1 apartment renovation, 3 of my job transitions, and whatever that was that happened between us in year 3, where we almost didn't make it, and then did, and then never fully talked about why. We got engaged in January of last year. I proposed at home, which she later described to Qley as sweet but kind of low-key, which I was not supposed to hear. I had made dinner. There were candles. The ring was exactly what she'd pointed to in a window 6 months earlier. She said yes. She cried. I thought we were fine. For 11 months, we were engaged. And then we weren't. That's all the backstory you need. The rest of it lived in the details. The embarrassment was never loud. That's what made it so difficult to name. It wasn't that Hannah said cruel things openly, or that she made a habit of humiliating me in company. It was subtler than that. It was the particular way she'd go quiet when I described something I was excited about. A walk along the river, a hole-in-the-wall Italian place I'd found in Brooklyn, a weekend I'd planned around a farmer's market, and a film screening that cost nothing and sounded, to me, like exactly the kind of Saturday I wanted to spend with someone I loved. She'd smile. She'd nod. And then she'd suggest we look at other options. The other options always involved a reservation somewhere that required a few weeks' notice. They always involved her checking the restaurant's Instagram before agreeing to go, specifically examining the aesthetic quality of the plating in other people's photos. They always involved what I privately began to think of as the performance, the careful, curated version of our life together that existed for an audience I could never quite identify. I noticed it first around our first anniversary. She'd photographed the table before we ate, then the food, then us. Then she'd spent the rest of dinner revising the caption, and I'd watched her face arrange itself into expressions of concentration so total that I'd stopped mid-sentence twice without her noticing. I said nothing. I noticed it again when we were at dinner with her colleagues. A man named Derek, who worked in finance and had recently bought a place in Tribeca, mentioned his renovation plans. Hannah had lit up in a way I recognized. Not the specific light of interest in Derek, but the light of interest in what Derek represented. The penthouse-level kind of life. The kind where the apartment itself was a statement and the weekend plans were worth documenting and every restaurant you visited confirmed something about your position in the world. I watched her watching him and said nothing. I noticed the comparison most directly about 4 months before the end, when we were walking back from a dinner that had apparently failed to meet an invisible standard. She was scrolling through her phone while we walked, which was a habit I had quietly come to dread, and she paused and showed me a photo, a mutual acquaintance's engagement party, held on a rooftop, with a view of the skyline that looked like money felt. That's what I mean, she said. I waited for what she meant. Like, experiences that feel elevated. That feel like something. I didn't say, our experiences feel like something to me. I already knew that wasn't the answer she was looking for. It was 3 weeks after that walk that I overheard her talking to Qley. I wasn't supposed to be home. I'd come back early from a work thing, let myself in quietly because she hadn't heard my key in the door, and then stood in the hallway for a moment longer than I should have because I heard my name. Connor means well, she was saying. He genuinely does. But there's a ceiling to him, Qley. Like a very comfortable ceiling. And I don't want to live the rest of my life in a room with a low ceiling. A pause. He thinks taking me to a farmer's market is a date. He thinks that's enough. Qley's voice, softer, asking something I couldn't hear clearly. I don't know, Hannah said. I've tried. I've tried to feel okay with it. But when I imagine the next 30 years, I just feel tired. I stepped back. I turned around. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, made enough noise to signal my arrival. She appeared a moment later, warmly, and kissed my cheek and asked how the work thing went. I told her it was fine. That conversation stayed in my head longer than I admitted to myself. It didn't make me angry, or it did, but underneath the anger was something else. Something quieter. The specific sadness of understanding that someone you love has a version of you in their head that is smaller than you actually are, and that they've made peace with that smaller version in a way that requires reducing you daily to make it fit. I didn't say anything. but I started paying closer attention. The escalation was gradual enough that I could have kept explaining it away, and for a while I did. Hannah had always known what she wanted. That was one of the things I'd initially admired about her. She had opinions. She had taste. She moved through rooms with a directness that I found attractive, a sense of purpose that felt like confidence. What I hadn't fully understood then was the difference between knowing what you want and needing what you want to be visible to other people. The condo conversation started in February. We'd been walking through a neighborhood in the West Village, a nothing in particular kind of Sunday, and she stopped in front of a building with a modern glass facade and a doorman, and a kind of deliberate silence around it that only expensive things have. "That's the building," she said. I knew which building she meant. She'd mentioned it before, not directly, but in the way she sometimes communicated desire, by circling it, returning to it, letting it appear in the conversation in different forms until I understood what she was asking. "Hannah," I said carefully, "that building starts at $4,000 a month. I know what it costs. I know we're not. I'm not saying tomorrow. I'm saying eventually." She turned to look at me. "I'm saying I want eventually to be part of our plan. I want to know that we're building towards something, not just staying comfortable." Comfortable. She said it the way some people say stagnant. The wedding conversation happened in March and was more direct. She'd been working with a planner, someone Qley had recommended, whose client list Hannah had researched carefully before agreeing to meet. And she came home one evening with a folder and a look on her face that I had learned to brace for. The number she put in front of me was significant. "This is the minimum," she said, "for what I actually want." I looked at the number. I did the arithmetic. I said something measured about timelines and budgets and the gap between where we were and what the folder described, and she listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has already decided that the practical objections are merely obstacles rather than realities. "Love doesn't pay for the life I want, Connor," she said finally. She said it flatly, not cruelly, but flatly, which was somehow worse. Like it was simply a fact she was reporting. Like she had done the calculation and arrived at the answer and was now reading it aloud for my benefit. I looked at her. There was something in her face that I hadn't seen there before, or maybe I had seen it and had spent a year and a half declining to name it. A kind of calculation, a weighing, not of me as a person, but of me as a variable in an equation she was constantly running. A look, a tone, a shift. Something felt final about it. Not in the relationship, not yet. We would have several more months of ordinary dinners and ordinary evenings, and the ordinary forward motion of two people sharing a life. But final in the way that a door that has been slowly drifting closed will eventually reach the frame. You can hear it before it happens. The air changes. Looking back, that should have been enough. What Hannah didn't know, what nobody knew, was that 6 months before she told me I had a ceiling, I had already started building past it. It began with Mason. I had known Mason for 3 years. We had the kind of friendship that functioned most naturally around whiteboards and late-night conversations about systems and problems, which suited me well enough because those conversations were where I felt most like myself. Mason was one of those people who moved through the world with a quality I'd always recognized but couldn't name until later. Not ambition, exactly, but a specific refusal to accept that the current version of things was the final version. He believed, practically and without sentimentality, that everything was improvable. It made him interesting to work with and occasionally exhausting to have a beer with. In April of the previous year, he sent me a message on a Tuesday evening. It was 3 sentences. An idea he'd been turning over. A gap he'd identified in B2B logistics software. A question about whether I wanted to look at it with him. I said yes. For the first 2 months, it was nothing. Weekend hours, shared documents, the tentative early architecture of something that might be a company or might be a very expensive hobby. I told no one. Not because I was deliberately keeping it secret, but because there was nothing to tell yet. It was too early to be real. I had learned, by then, that announcing unfinished things was a reliable way of making them feel smaller, and this thing, whatever it was, I did not want to make smaller. Hannah asked once, early on, why I was sometimes up late on the laptop. I said it was work. She didn't ask again. By August, Mason and I had something. Not a product, exactly, but a proof of concept solid enough that we had shown it to a few people, and those people had not walked away. One of them, a man named Gerald who ran a mid-sized distribution company in New Jersey, had walked toward it instead. He had sat with it for 3 weeks, come back with questions, and then asked us to have dinner with him. At that dinner, Gerald told us he wanted to be involved. I drove home that night in a state of quiet that I recognized as the specific calm that follows something large. Not excitement, exactly. More like the feeling of understanding, all at once, that the shape of your life has changed, even if the change is not visible yet on the surface. I didn't tell Hannah. I wanted to. I turned it over in my mind, the conversation, the way I would explain it, the version of her reaction I hoped for. But something stopped me. Not distrust, not yet. Just a sense that this thing was fragile in ways I didn't fully understand, and that fragile things needed to be held quietly until they could hold their own weight. By October, Mason and I had signed a formal agreement. Gerald's investment allowed us to hire 2 engineers, secure proper infrastructure, move out of the shared document phase, and into something real. We filed. We structured. We set a product launch date for the following spring. I was still living in Hannah's apartment. I was still attending engagement-related discussions about venues and florals and what version of the seating arrangement worked best for her mother's side of the family. I was doing both of these things simultaneously, and the disconnect between them was interesting to inhabit, though I didn't have a word for it at the time. Then, in November, 2 months before the restaurant, came the opportunity that changed the trajectory of everything. A distribution network with operations in 4 states reached out to Mason through a contact. They had an integration problem. They had been searching for a solution for 8 months. A meeting was arranged. Mason and I flew to Chicago on a Thursday, sat in a conference room for 4 hours, and flew home on Friday. On Monday, they called with a number. I sat with that number for a full day before I let myself believe it was real. Then I called Mason. Then I sat quietly in the conference room at my day job with the door closed for 20 minutes, looking at nothing. The deal would not close until March. There was paperwork. There was due diligence. There were weeks of back and forth that required a specific kind of patience I had to consciously practice. But the shape of it was clear. I was 31 years old and I had just signed, in principle, the deal that would make the company real in ways that went beyond Gerald's initial investment. Real in the way that changes the number you carry in your head when you think about what is possible. I still told no one. 3 weeks later, Hannah and I went to dinner. Let me go back to that table. We had arrived at 7:30 at a restaurant she had chosen, somewhere new, well-reviewed, the kind of place with a waiting list and a menu that described itself in geological terms. We had been seated well. She had photographed the bread. We had ordered. And then, somewhere between the starter and the main, the conversation had shifted in a way that I should have felt coming, but somehow didn't. She had been quiet for most of the meal. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people who don't need to fill space, but the preloaded quiet of someone who arrived at dinner having already decided what they were going to say. "Can I tell you something honestly?" she said. I said she could. "You know what? I'm tired of pretending your simplicity feels romantic instead of limiting." There was the word again. Limiting. This time applied directly. I waited. "I've been thinking about this for a while," she continued. "And I think I've been waiting for you to become someone different. And I don't think that's fair. To either of us. Who did you want me to become?" I asked. My voice was even. I was genuinely curious. She looked faintly frustrated by the question, as though it had arrived from the wrong direction. Someone with more drive. Someone who wants more. Someone who looks at this city and sees opportunity instead of just background. "I see opportunity," I said. "Connor." Her tone was patient and final at once, the tone of someone ending a debate they consider already settled. "You think small. You've always thought small. And I can't build a life around small thinking. I think I deserve someone who matches where I want to go." There it was. She had spent 5 years observing me and had arrived at a conclusion I couldn't argue her out of, not because the conclusion was correct, but because it was hers. She had built it carefully from selected evidence. The farmer's market dates, the modest apartment, the quiet evenings, the absence of performance. She had looked at all of it and decided it added up to limitation. And now she was presenting me with her findings, and her face said she considered this a kindness. "You lack ambition," she said. "I'm sorry, but you do." I thought about Mason. I thought about Chicago. I thought about the number. I said nothing. She wasn't finished. "I've been compromising on this for so long. I kept thinking it would change. I kept thinking you'd evolve or something. That some switch would flip and you'd start wanting what I want. But you don't. And I'm done waiting." "Okay," I said. The word landed strangely. She blinked. "That's it," she said. "Okay. What would you like me to say, Hannah?" She stared at me. And I looked at her. Really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months without the buffer of hope or habit. And what I saw was someone I had loved genuinely and completely for 5 years, someone I had known with the particular depth that only long time produces, and someone who had been building a case against me in private for longer than I had understood. I looked down at my hand. I took off the ring. I placed it beside her drink with a quiet, final click. Her face went very still. I raised my hand for the waiter without looking at her again. When he appeared, I said, "Check, please." I paid. I stood. I buttoned my jacket with the calm, unhurried motions of a man who has somewhere to be and no reason to rush. She said my name once, softly, as I stepped back from the table. I looked at her, not with coldness, not with anger, just looked at her, the way you might look at a place you've loved that you know you won't return to. And then I turned and walked toward the door. The restaurant noise filled the space behind me. I didn't look back. There was no speech, no final declaration, no moment where I leaned in and told her what she'd missed, what she hadn't seen, what was waiting around the corner that she'd just permanently walked herself out of. I gave her none of that, not because I was incapable of it. I had the words. I had, in fact, a great number of words. But I understood something in that moment that I had perhaps been learning slowly for years. Silence, chosen deliberately, is not the same as having nothing to say. Sometimes it is the clearest and most final thing you can say. The audience always expects a fight. I gave them nothing. Ethan had a spare room that smelled like old books and benign neglect, and I lived in it for 6 weeks. He asked me once, in the careful way Ethan asked things, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee and the deliberate neutrality of someone trying not to lead the witness, whether I was doing okay. I told him I was. He studied me for a long moment, and then said, "You seem weirdly calm," and I told him that seemed about right. I didn't tell him about Mason. I didn't tell him about the deal. I had kept the secret for 6 months by then, and it had become a practice, almost a discipline, and I found I wasn't ready to release it yet. The thing that was building needed, I felt, to finish building before I let anyone else see it. The weeks that followed the restaurant were strange in their texture. There was grief. I want to be honest about that. There were mornings that arrived with a particular weight, the weight of absence, of the specific architecture of a shared life that had been suddenly vacated. I missed her, not the version of her that had sat across from me at that table with her conclusions and her catalog of my limitations, but the version of her that had laughed easily at certain things, that had reached for my hand in movie theaters, that had known me at my edges. That version I mourned genuinely, but the mourning had a floor to it. It didn't go all the way down, and I think that was because underneath the grief there was something else, a forward motion, a current, something already in progress that gave the days a direction even when the days themselves felt hollow. The deal closed in March. I remember the exact moment. I was at the kitchen table in Ethan's apartment, on a call with Mason and our lawyer, and then the call ended, and I set the phone down and looked out the window at a Tuesday morning in New York and thought, there it is. By April, we had an office. For people, real infrastructure, a client base that was expanding faster than our projections. Mason and I were working 16-hour days that felt, against all logic, less exhausting than the years I'd spent working 8-hour days on things I didn't believe in. I found an apartment in May, West Side, high floor, views I had never allowed myself to consider before. I furnished it slowly and with the specific pleasure of someone doing something entirely for themselves for the first time in years. No compromises, no invisible audience, no Instagram consideration. Just the objects and the light and the space I wanted. Ethan came over for the first time and stood in the living room for a long moment, and then turned to me and said, "Okay, so, what exactly have you been doing?" I told him about Mason. I told him about Gerald. I told him about Chicago and the deal and the company and the spring launch. He sat down. He looked at me for a very long time. "When did this start?" he said. "April of last year. You were engaged to Hannah in April of last year." "Yes." Another long pause. She had no idea? No. He shook his head slowly. Not with judgment. Ethan wasn't built for judgment, but with the specific amazement of someone recalibrating a story they thought they understood. "Connor," he said finally. "I know," I said. The campaign came in June. Mason had connected us with a branding firm, a choice that had seemed premature to me until I saw the initial concepts, at which point I stopped arguing about premature. The company had grown fast enough that visibility was no longer a vanity. It was a necessity. We were doing things in logistics infrastructure that were genuinely new, and the story of what we were doing was, it turned out, compelling enough to attract the kind of attention that accelerates more growth. The campaign included outdoor advertising. It was Mason's idea, and initially, I pushed back. I was still the person who had never had a social media presence worth mentioning. Still the person who had spent 5 years being told that my comfort with invisibility was a flaw. But Mason made the argument practically, and practically he was right, and so I agreed. Meanwhile, across the city, in a life I was no longer part of, Hannah had moved to a smaller apartment in a neighborhood she had previously described as a lateral move at best. The West Village condo had not materialized. The wedding photographer's deposit had been returned, minus a cancellation fee. The planner's folder sat somewhere, I assumed, in a box. Qley, to her credit, had stayed loyal to Hannah in the way that close friends do, present and supportive and careful. But another friend, a mutual one who moved in both circles, had mentioned to Ethan, who had mentioned to me without editorializing, that Hannah had started picking up extra shifts, that the job she had taken, reception at a corporate office building, was a practical decision rather than a chosen one, that the life she had wanted, the elevated, image-appropriate, skyline-adjacent life, was not moving closer. Hannah, one evening, found me online. Not my personal social media, I had none, but a piece in a trade publication about the company, a mention of the Chicago deal, a photograph of Mason and me at an industry event, both of us in suits, in a room full of people who were there because they wanted to be in a room with us. She texted Qley immediately. Qley, I learned later, didn't know what to say. Hannah went looking for more. She found the company website. She found my name in a press release about the distribution network deal. She found an interview Mason and I had done together, where the journalist had asked about origin stories, and Mason had said something about the months of quiet development before the launch, the deliberate decision to build before announcing. She found all of it in an evening. What happened next was worse. She saw the billboard on a Wednesday morning in late June. The building where Hannah worked reception was on the west side of Midtown, a glass tower that faced a wide intersection. She had walked past that intersection every working morning for 4 months. She knew the light cycle. She knew the coffee cart on the near corner. She knew the particular quality of the morning light on the glass facade of the building across the street. What she didn't know, until that Wednesday, was what had been mounted on the side of that facing building overnight. It was a large format advertising panel, the kind of installation that takes a crew and scaffolding and overnight hours to assemble. It had been placed as part of the citywide rollout of the campaign. Mason's idea, the one I had initially resisted and then conceded to on practical grounds. And on it was my face, my name, the company name, a clean, direct visual, the kind of design that works because it doesn't oversell itself, because it trusts its subject to carry the weight. Just the image and the words and the sense of confidence that a company has when it knows what it has built is real. Hannah stopped walking. The people around her continued. The morning current of bodies moved past her on the sidewalk and she stood against it, stationary, looking up. The face on the billboard was the face of the man she had told, 7 months earlier, that he thought small. The face of the man she had described to her best friend as a comfortable ceiling. The face she had looked at across a restaurant table and named average, and then set a ring down beside her wine glass and returned to sender. That face was 40 feet tall, mounted on a wall visible from the entrance of her workplace, advertising a company that the industry press had spent the previous 2 months describing as one of the most significant logistics infrastructure developments in the Northeast. She stood there for a long time. Abigail, a colleague who worked the front desk alongside her and had become, in the way that proximity produces, someone Hannah was close to by default, noticed Hannah hadn't come through the door. She stepped outside. She found Hannah at the edge of the lobby entrance, not quite on the sidewalk, looking up at the billboard with an expression that Abigail would later describe, in a private message to a mutual friend who eventually told Ethan, as gutted. Just completely gutted. Hannah. Abigail said. Hannah said something that Abigail didn't catch. Then she said, clearly enough to be heard, I know him. Abigail looked up at the billboard. Then back at Hannah. That's Connor, Hannah said. I was engaged to him. And then she began to cry. Not quietly. Not the contained, manageable kind of crying that can be explained away as allergies or a long week. The kind of crying that comes from understanding something all at once that your body has already been holding and trying to process for months without permission. Abigail put a hand on her shoulder and said something gentle. Hannah didn't respond to it. She was still looking at the billboard. Here is what was breaking through the surface. The understanding, arriving with the specific cruelty of retrospective clarity that the company on that billboard had existed before she walked away. That the deal, the growth, the campaign, the 40-foot face on the side of a building she walked past every morning, all of it had been in motion while she sat across a candlelit table in a well-reviewed restaurant and told me I was comfortable being average. She had held the ring in her hand and set it aside like something she had decided was not worth keeping. She had walked away from everything she said she wanted, not because it hadn't been there, but because she hadn't known to look for it, because she had confused quietness with smallness, because she had seen a man who didn't perform his ambitions and assumed he had none. The simplicity she had called limiting had been, the whole time, something else entirely. She stood outside the building for 11 minutes. Abigail kept her company. Eventually, Hannah straightened up, wiped her face, and went inside. But the billboard didn't move. Every morning after that, it was there. She texted me first. A short message. Careful, measured. I could tell she had written it several times before sending. It said she had seen the news about the company and that she wanted to reach out and that she hoped I was well. I read it. I put the phone face down on my desk. I went back to what I was working on. The second message came 3 days later. Longer. It talked about the billboard in a way that managed to be both direct and oblique at once. She didn't say I stood outside my office building crying at your face for 11 minutes, but something in the phrasing gestured toward it. She said she'd had time to think, that she'd been thinking a lot, actually, that she wanted to have a conversation if I was open to it. I was not open to it. I didn't respond unkindly. I simply didn't respond. There was an email in July, a longer one, more formal somehow, as though the formality of the medium might lend the communication a weight that the texts hadn't carried. She talked about the relationship. She talked about what she had said at the restaurant and offered a version of the word sorry that arrived wrapped in enough qualifications that it retained a certain amount of its size. She talked about how she had been looking at things wrong and how she understood that now. I read the email twice. I closed the window. A mutual friend, someone who had remained carefully neutral throughout, a man named David who had known us both for 3 years, called me in August and said, after some preliminary conversation about other things, that Hannah had asked him to ask me if I'd be willing to meet. I appreciate you calling, I told David. Tell her I wish her well. He paused. That's it. That's it. Through Qley, who had apparently decided that loyalty to Hannah required at least one attempt, a message arrived saying that Hannah was struggling and would really value hearing from me. I thought about that for a moment. Then I thought about a restaurant table in winter and a word, limiting, arriving so casually that it barely disturbed the air. I didn't respond. This is the part that I think people expect to be different. They expect a confrontation, a scene, a moment where I tell her exactly what she missed and exactly how wrong she was. They expect the billboard to be a weapon. They expect me to use it. But here is what I had understood, quietly, across the months between January and now. The thing she had done to me had not been done out of malice. It had been done out of a failure of vision, an inability to see past the surface of things, to understand that depth doesn't always announce itself. She had wanted something from me that I had actually been offering. She just hadn't recognized it in the form it came. That was not something I could explain to her. That was something she had to understand herself. And besides, I was fine. I was genuinely fine. Not in the way people say they're fine when they mean the opposite. In the way that means the days had weight and direction and the specific pleasure of work that you believe in. In the way that means you wake up in an apartment you chose for yourself and you sit with your coffee and look at the city and the size of it matches something in you rather than making you feel small inside it. I had met someone. Abigail, the same Abigail who had stood with Hannah on the sidewalk, who had put a hand on her shoulder while she cried at my face on a wall, had left that job in August and was now doing something in design that she described with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who has recently found the correct fit. Ethan knew someone who knew her. We had dinner in a group and then dinner not in a group and then the kind of evenings that begin to arrange themselves naturally, without effort, the way the right things tend to. I mentioned none of this to Hannah's attempts at contact. There was no point. There was no message to send. There was no revenge in it. It was simply a life, continuing, after a thing that had ended. Mason noticed the change in me around September and said, in his particular way, practical, unadorned, that I seemed good. I am good, I said. The billboard thing, he said. The Hannah thing. I figured that would be, I don't know, more complicated. It was complicated for about a month, I said. Then it wasn't. He nodded. He went back to his screen. Hannah, I learned through Ethan, through David, through the unhurried telegraph of mutual social connections, had eventually stopped reaching out. She had quietly moved into a smaller apartment again, in a good neighborhood, but not a statement one. She was still at the reception desk job. She had taken up something, running, I think, or maybe ceramics. The message was unclear, that seemed to be about redirecting her energy towards something internal. And somewhere in there, without any announcement and without any particular drama, I think she finally understood the thing that the billboard had been trying to tell her. Not the part about the company, or the deal, or the 40-foot face on the side of a building, but the part underneath all of that. The part about what simplicity actually means in a person who has chosen it. I walked past that billboard once more in October. I wasn't looking for it. The city had become ordinary again in the way it always does. The way anything enormous becomes background once you've decided to stop being awed by it. I was just walking, on my way somewhere, early in the morning when the city is its clearest. And there it was. I stopped for a moment. Looked up. It looked the same as it always looked. Clean, direct, confident. The way good things tend to look when you strip away everything unnecessary. I thought about Hannah, briefly and without heat. I thought about a restaurant table and a ring set down beside a wine glass and the sound of my own footsteps walking away. I thought about what she had called it. Limitation. Simplicity. Comfortable. Average. Small. I thought about all the things she had been trying to tell me when she said those words, and what they revealed about her and not about me, and how long it had taken me to understand that the gap between us had never been about ambition or money or the altitude of a condo in the West Village. It had been about what we each believed a life was for. She had wanted a life that could be photographed, a life that read well from the outside, a life whose value was confirmed daily by comparison and visibility and the appropriate responses of an appropriate audience. I had wanted something quieter than that, something that worked when nobody was watching, something that held its shape in an empty room. Neither of those is wrong, exactly. They are just different, profoundly, irreconcilably different. And we had both, in our own ways, spent 5 years pretending otherwise. I turned away from the billboard. Abigail was waiting at the coffee cart on the corner, 2 cups in hand, the morning light doing what morning light does in October in New York, which is something specific and irreplaceable. She saw me looking at the billboard and tilted her head in a silent question. Nothing, I said. She handed me the coffee. We kept walking. She called it limitation. I called it enough. And I never looked back.